John, if I open the chat box, we'll just see if there's any little comments from students.
Yep, feel free to fire up the chat box.
Okay.
While we're waiting here, everybody, if you would real quick, you want to throw a quick introduction of yourself and kind of where you're coming, high school, middle school, where you were at. We'd really appreciate it. And I'm sure Dr. and I'm going to mess this up because I probably did it again this morning. It's Wedin.
Wedin.
Dr. Wedin, thank you, Dave. Dr. Wedin would love to hear from you and kind of know where you're at.
Kind of want to know where you're from as well as where you're at school.
So for those of you that may not have done a webinar or joined us for the first time or not seen one of our videos, I'm Dr. John Lohr, Vice President of STEM Education here at Science Olympiad. Excited for you to join us. And Dr. Wedin is from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, our 2025 tournament host. And I think you saw a lot of his stuff in the announcement of I would graciously refer to him as a expert on grasslands and the understanding of prairies, and he's got some really cool stuff I know he's going to talk about here at the end of the presentations, and especially if any of you guys also happen to do fossils. I think you're going to absolutely love what he's got to share with you and the connection between fossils and grasslands.
I don't know what I'm going to do about this. To show you the level of distraction. When I have bones on the table, like bones of different kinds of herbivores, my dog Kip goes crazy. He's been known to run off with my treasured fossil bones and try to bury them in the yard. So
all right.
Hopefully he'll behave. Right, Kip? Okay.
Fingers crossed. All right, everybody, just for some housekeeping, you can put stuff in the chat. If you get asked a question or there's like some kind of interactive piece, please feel free to throw your answers in the chat. Also, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties or things you want to verify, go ahead and throw it in the chat and we'll confirm, issues around sound or video quality, that kind of thing. If you have questions about content, I would highly encourage you to use the question and answer feature, and that's the little box with the question mark in it, because it's just a little bit easier for us to track. As always with all of these webinars, you will get the recording. As soon as we can, we'll send you the link so you can view it in the cloud, but we also are going to move it to our Science Olympiad YouTube channel. So you will have the opportunity to view this afterwards and kind of go back and take a look. So then without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Dave and let him get started. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. And hi to Rian and Wendy and Sophia and some others that chatted, said hello. Feel free to throw in more stuff. And let's share the screen. So I was torn between what I think you should know, what I should tell you, and what I want to tell you. And at the end, we're going to get a little bit into here. Kip, have another bone. Don't eat my bone. Don't eat my demonstrations. By the end, I'm gonna talk to you about this fossil horse and the evolution of its teeth, okay, and how that relates to grasslands and climate change. But we got a little ways to go before we get there. And my dog Kip is trying to steal the bones. So anyway, cool, we go on. Good, thank you. I'm at University of Nebraska. I've been a professor here about 25 years, and some of you may know that if you're coming to the national event at the end of May, that's in Lincoln, Nebraska. So you'll see me and you'll see some of the places I'll refer to. I have a position, it sounds more important than it is. I'm the director of the Center for Grassland Studies. So I work with people from different departments, natural resources, biology, agronomy, animal science, and we try to do some grassland stuff, okay? So let's start with this global map. And I'll push this off to the side. And I'm moving my little screens around, so I'm not interfering here. Go back. So major grasslands of the world, some of these grassland regions. At the top, you'll see that I wrote steppes, pastures, meadows, prairies, rangeland, grasslands. Each of these words has a little different baggage, a little different connotation. They're all somewhat interchangeable. They often have to do with how these grasslands are used. On this picture, you're going to see names of some of the world's famous grasslands. In this diagram, they've separated out tropical grassland regions. I'll talk about the word savanna in a second versus more temperate regions. Two of the hugest, the huge temperate grassland regions are the Great Plains of North America over here, and Nebraska is kind of in the middle of that. The steppes, the grasslands, Ukraine is here. As you know, there's a war going on right there right now, and across into Russia and some of the stands. Much of that is no longer intact grassland. So let's see here. If we look at North America, I'm going to try to, let me try to move this. If I can get that little window, I'm going to put it at the bottom. Okay. If in the Great Plains aren't the only grasslands of North America, but it's certainly the biggest chunk. It's usually thought of as a grassland biome. And one of the things we're going to talk about today are the factors that determine where grasslands occur. We're going to see that grasslands are quite dynamic. That sometimes some of these grasslands in southern New Mexico, southern Arizona, southern Texas have undergone desertification, and they're not grasslands anymore. You'd consider them as desert. In other areas, some of these grasslands in the Midwest, John's over here near Chicago, and there's a lot of movement to try to restore some of the original oak savannas and grasslands, because this area in the east, what we call the Prairie Peninsula, wants to be forest or city or cropland, doesn't want to be grassland anymore. Okay. What are other factors here? The map actually in a lighter color shows some grassland areas in eastern Washington, and much of the California Valley was originally grassland. Most of those species are gone. Most of that's European type species now that have come in. Okay. Okay, a little time lag here. So if we ask the question, what is the climate of grasslands, or where do grasslands fit in terms of global climate, which would determine part of those global maps that you just saw? It's a kind of standard textbook graph, both probably high school textbooks, certainly college textbooks. The beginning of an ecology textbook, you're going to learn about biomes. What characterizes these different types of vegetation with different structure, and what kind of climate regions do they fall into? So if you look at this graph, which I'm going to assume you haven't seen before, and I think Science Olympiad bops from biome to biome in different years. And so for this year, the ecology section is dealing with grasslands and deserts in yellow down here. In other years, I think you've dealt with other sort of ecosystems. So the horizontal axis here is mean average temperature. We're going from cold on the right to hot on the left. And so we're seeing tundra is over here at, this is in degrees centigrade, but yeah, cold. And then we have precipitation going up the y-axis. We're going from very dry to very wet, mean annual precipitation. Now, temperature and precipitation interact. If you're in a if you're in a warm landscape, evaporation is going to take care of a lot of that water. Your water's not going to go as far. If you're in a cold landscape, you may think you're not getting that much precipitation, but it might be enough to sustain trees and productivity. So I've circled in red this area that's just much more fascinating than this graph implies, because we can see what we're calling grasslands. They've lumped it with desert here. We can see grasslands transitioning to savannas. We can see grasslands transitioning to what I'd call a woodland. And where there's theoretically a line here, and some maps, some graphs like this are going to have little dots that show actual places on Earth and what might be the natural vegetation there. I have the picture of the elephant here destroying a tree, just to remind me that there's a lot of factors that can move this line. And we're going to be talking about those some. Drought, fire, herbivores like grazers, herbivores like browsers that are eating woody vegetation, can really push these zones all over the place. So grasslands are dynamic. Now, this is an older graph. I apologize, but I use this in my classes. I teach classes in both grassland ecology, and I teach some forestry courses. But to me, when I look at vegetation, this is from the Midwest of the United States, is where this paper was done. I just see a continuum. That continuum you can see is the schematic diagram at the bottom is showing you on the left an ecosystem that has zero tree cover, right? You're standing there, you look up, you simply don't see trees or leaves above you anywhere. You know, if you go walk 100 yards in any direction, you're not going to encounter a tree, maybe a shrub, some shrubs, okay? Now, people agree they could use different names, but that's grassland or a prairie. It could be that if it is, you've lost all the grass species and it's sand and gravel, you'd call it a desert. Okay. So everybody agrees on what you call the left hand. Zero tree cover, grassland. On the other hand, if you're in a dense, what we call a closed canopy forest, you go anywhere, you look up, you're going to, in the summer, you're going to see leaves. Okay. It's interesting that, and it's usually more than 90% tree cover. So the sun, direct sunlight is intercepted by that canopy. It's actually far shadier than you think it is because your eyes are amazing at adjusting to low light levels. That sun canopy can easily knock out 80, 90% of incoming solar radiation, that forest canopy. But you can still read a book. Your eyes are adjusting and stuff. For plants trying to accomplish photosynthesis and make a living, you knock out 90% of the light with a forest canopy. A lot of plant species are not going to be able to have photosynthesis that's successful. They're going to die. So we agree on the right-hand side, 100% canopy, that's a forest. Then we 0% tree canopy, that's a grassland. And then it's interesting on this comparison. I knew Don, who made this graph back in 1995. These are different groups. Curtis was a famous ecologist in Wisconsin, one of the United Nations groups, the Nature Conservancy, some other international groups. Scientists want, people, I guess, in general, want to define things. Are you in a grassland or are you in a savanna? Are you in a savanna or are you in a forest? And so there's different definitions here. I like this one that the Nature Conservancy uses in North America, that if you have less than 10% tree cover, which might be a couple of trees every acre, maybe in the size of a football field, you'd have 2 or 3 trees. Okay. We're going to call that a prairie or a grassland. Okay. But if you get a bit more dense trees, you get a few more popping up, little islands or clusters of trees, then most people now will call that a savanna. The term savanna, you still might see in some of your sources you find on Google and such, people saying, well, savanna is a tropical word. Actually, if you look back at this map, it said savanna for African here in Australia. And that doesn't have the word savanna for any of these temperate regions. To me, savanna means structure. What's the ratio of trees to grasses? And if it's this low open canopy, I'll call it a savanna. Where John's from in Illinois, uh, a lot of interest in oak savannas, where these scattered trees out in the prairie would be bur oaks. And there's a lot of species that depend on that. Okay, well, if you're from, I don't know if anybody's from the Southwest on this group, but if you're from the Southwest and a lot of the Western US, they're not going to use the land managers aren't going to necessarily use the word forest, especially at low elevation in the Rocky Mountains. It's just too open. It's not closed canopy. So if you're in the pinyon juniper zone with pinyon trees and juniper trees outside of Santa Fe or in Arizona or the Mesa Verde National Park in Southwest Colorado, they call that the PJ zone, the pinyon juniper woodland zone. And they're using the word woodland here to mean, well, it's got more trees than a savanna, but it still is not closed canopy. It's probably less than 70% or so, something canopy cover. And that number is going to matter because there's certain types of important prairie grasses and plants. If you get more than 70% shade, they just drop out. They're not going to be doing well. And then forest, everybody agrees on forest when it gets closed canopy. Does that make sense? One way of thinking about this structurally, now I'm not sure this is going to come up in your science Olympiad questions and tests or not, but when you're walking around a landscape, especially if many parts of the country, you'll find these gradations, even within a single park or area, from an open grassland to maybe a closed forest, and maybe you have something kind of in between. I like to think of the squirrel test in defining like a savanna versus a woodland, right? If if a squirrel has to get from point A to point B across a grassland, and by I mean a chunk, like a couple football fields long, so like 5, 6 acres, the squirrel has no choice but to run across the ground. There are no trees to get in. Okay. Squirrels in a savanna, the trees are scattered, spread apart. Sure, the squirrel can go up a tree, but if he has to get from one side to the other side of this large area, he's going to have to get on the ground, right? Because the trees are separate, they're not overlapping. Okay. And so at some point, he's going to have to get down, run to the next tree, climb the next tree. Maybe there's a couple in a cluster. The concept of a woodland is if the squirrel works at it, he or she can probably chart a path from one side of this area to the other side, because these patches and islands and little fingers of trees and tall shrubs are kind of winding their way and connecting across that grassland. So maybe it's only 50% grassland, but the way those trees are patterned and stuff, you can imagine getting from canopy to canopy to canopy and working your way across. In the forest, squirrel has no problem. So that's the squirrel test, if you want to think of it that way. So I'll use these words, and in my mind, the savanna is the most confusing because, well, like the landscape of the Lion King, tropical savanna, tropical grassland, and the Serengeti of East Africa. Is that a grassland? Is that a savanna? Are we responsible for that in our science Olympiad? Where are these grasslands that we're studying? I'm certainly going to include, in my mind, some of these open savannas and grasslands in my definition. Just to show you that point, I'm over here in Nebraska. Nobody in Lincoln, Nebraska participated in this map. So there's kind of a hard edge here at the Missouri River. Theoretically, there were no oak savannas occurring in Nebraska, which is not true. There's a few along the Missouri River. John's over here with the Science Olympiad offices around Chicago, and the light gray on this map indicates regions that were a mixture of open prairie or grassland and these scattered oak savannas where you have scattered trees across the landscape. The picture shows a big, beautiful, open grown bur oak. You can usually tell a tree that's grown in the open from a tree that's grown in a dense forest, because the lower branches just spread out to capture light. If a tree is crowded when it grows in a dense stand of trees, it's going to not have those open lower branches. So that's a savanna tree. You can go around some of these regions, conservation regions in Cook County around Chicago, and kind of there's some debate about how to manage conservation areas in that greater Chicago area. If you have these scattered old oaks that are obviously open grown, they were obviously growing out in the prairie when they were young, but today they're crowded by other trees. What do we do for management? Do we want to take this back to savanna? Well, then you're going to use a chainsaw a lot of, you're going to cut out a lot of trees to make it go back to that. Anyway, and even as you get in this Prairie Peninsula further into the east, into Indiana and Ohio and Kentucky, Missouri, southern Missouri, the amount of open prairie you found was less in some areas that were moister, wetter along rivers and such had dense forests, but you still found scattered open savannas. It's all changed with management. Okay. So questions on that? John's watching the chat box. Anybody has any questions, or were there landscapes might fit in this?
The only question, and I think you might have touched on it, is uh was how does a grassland turn into a desert? Like what has to happen there? And I know you had talked about, well, it's a mix of the temperature and the rainfall, and then you
Right.
could also end up with like overgrazing and that kind of thing. But I don't know if there's anything else that needs to be added.
Well, it's usually at the dry end of this gradient. This is showing, you know, one reason on a broad continental scale is usually this is going to be more rainfall, more moist on the right, and usually somewhat drier on the left with the grasslands. And then you'll find certain areas like southwestern US, Texas, other parts of the world. I'll show you some maps and graphs in a bit where we see where deserts fit in. I know that desert is part of the topic for the ecology top material this year in Science Olympiad. I'm not talking about deserts as much, although if people wanted, we could, certainly do kind of just a desert focused presentation someday. But in much of the southern, it's in the Texas and the Southwest, what are now deserts would have been grasslands until they had 200 or 300 years of just heavy uncontrolled grazing. I'm not saying grazing is bad for grasslands, but some ecosystems are vulnerable to that. So we'll get back to that. Good point, John.
All right.
So, like I said, there's some content here, and we'll get to some fun stuff with these fossils and stuff in a bit. There's some key points about grasslands. Many of these things you'll find out if you just go to Google, and I think World Wildlife Fund, National Geographic. I mean, there's a lot of places that will have a nice kind of overview of grasslands on their website. The grasslands, and in that I would include tropical savannas, make up about 40% of the native vegetation on the Earth's surface. So they're important. Obviously, it's usually the drier areas, usually not the coastal areas. It's usually more towards the middle of the continents, where we get like the Great Plains. At this latitude, our prevailing winds come from the west. And so as moist air comes off the Pacific, it has to clear first the Sierras and the Cascades, and then it has to clear the Rockies. Every time, if you've studied that, as moist air has to go up in elevation, cold air doesn't hold as much moisture as warm air. And having to get up high, that purges the water, the precipitation out of those. So as you come down off those mountains to the east, if you get into Nevada or Utah, on the east side of the Rockies, a lot of their moisture has been purged out. It's up there at high altitude, up at Donner Pass in the top of the Sierras. Okay. Anyway, so there's some patterns in terms of where these grasslands occur. I'll talk a little bit more about grasslands in particular, what makes them unique for grasses and how they grow. Uh, I noticed that on the concepts here, diversity is one of the concepts. So here's a diversity concept. Although grasses almost always make up most or over half of the biomass, the plant stuff you'll see out there in a grassland. That's why we call it a grassland. And primary production, I'm defining that as annual capture of carbon and making photosynthesis and sugar. That's how we produce new biomass. So there's both the production of biomass each year, and then there's a bunch of biomass sitting around if nothing got rid of it. Uh, and so, yeah, most of that's grass in a grassland. But most of the plant species, the diversity of plants in a grassland are actually what you might just call flowers. They're broadleaf plants. They're not grasses. And just to be technical, when I'm talking about grasses, I'm usually including some other grass-like plants, like sedges. You might know what those are, but they look like grasses in general, function like that. So broadleaf plants make up over 80% of the plant diversity in most grasslands. And so it's interesting, a famous Wisconsin ecologist in the 60s wrote, just looking at the number of types of plants you see in the grasslands of Wisconsin, he said we should really call these daisy lands rather than grasslands. And so here are some of the other common plant families you're going to find. The most common plant families in North America. Other continents have a different biogeographic history. Composites include the daisies, sunflowers, plants like that family. Most common plant family in terms of number of plant species in our North American grasslands. Legumes would be second. Legumes are important for a couple of reasons. One of them is legumes are able to use nitrogen from the atmosphere. They're able to tap into that nitrogen because they have little henchmen, little bacteria that help them fix or capture that nitrogen and convert it into ammonium and nitrate that they can use to grow. So legumes often play an important role in both natural grasslands and then even managed grasslands. If you have a hay field in Europe or a hay field in the eastern US, one way to avoid having to add fertilizer to it to maintain the productivity of the hay is just to have a mixture of grasses and legumes. Because the legumes, in a sense, are pumping in nitrogen, pumping in extra fertilizer. So that's important in prairies. Okay. Mints, there's quite a few mint species, lilies, members of the rose family. Roses are shrubs, they're little perennial shrubs, but there's other herbaceous or non-woody plants. And milkweed, there's quite a few milkweed species. We have like 8 milkweeds common in our Nebraska prairies. So I'll just throw this out. Somebody can put in the chat box. If grasses make up most of the productivity and biomass of a grassland, and most of these flowers are not that common, but there's a lot of them. Why do they matter? Why, if we were going to plant a prairie, would we plant more than grass? Somebody throw that out. I can't see my chat box right now. But
Go ahead. What do you guys think of that question?
Why would you add flowers if you were planting a grassland?
All right, Wendy's got tossed an answer in. Anybody else?
Oh, here's the chat box.
Yeah. So we had thank you, Margot. All right, Sophia's got one in.
Yep, I like all those answers.
Yeah.
Wendy said pollinators, right? Grasses are wind pollinated. For the most part, they don't produce extra pollen and they don't produce nectar that any kind of pollinating bee or butterfly or moth is going to care about. All right. And yeah, yeah, the last answer is, well, it'd be a monoculture. Well, maybe monocultures are good for some reasons. Corn is a monoculture of grass. Uh, so but I like the idea that they create a diversity of food sources. Um, if you look at the most abundant types of the type of living organism that has the most species on Earth are the insects. Okay, I entomology, the study of insect, just kind of scares me. If you take an entomology class in college, you're lucky to get out knowing how to identify different families of insects, uh, because, for instance, in our native prairies on the edge of Lincoln, we had a graduate student and she was inventorying the bee species. And so we had 60 to 80 species of native wild bees, not counting the honeybees, which are introduced. Well, they're getting nothing from the grasses, all those bees. Okay. And they're performing all sorts of services, pollinating, moving nectar around, and everything else. Okay. But if you take a plant like a goldenrod, which is a composite, uh, insects, some of them are kind of generalists. They just eat whatever part of the plants in front of them, but a lot of insects are specialists. I realized, I think, did I spell composite wrong there? Anyway, it's looking strange to me. Um, so on a goldenrod, I could usually find you 4 or 5 species of insect that use that one goldenrod species, because you might have certain insects that specialize on the roots. They're living below ground and gnawing away, or other sort of things below ground, um, like little nematodes. You have stem borers. If you ever hiked in a field or in the fall and on a goldenrod stem, you'll see these little round balls. If you break one off and cut it with a knife, you'll see it's kind of corky. But in the middle, there's often a little worm, right? So these stem borers have drilled into that stem and laid their little larvae, and that'll hatch out the next year and I assume fly away in some way. Okay. And then you have others that are just munching on the leaves. They love the green leaves. You have others that are invading the flowers and replacing the seeds in the flower heads of that goldenrod with their little larvae. Um, so the diversity kind of builds diversity. Right? If we have diversity at the plant level between the birds, the mammals, and particularly the insects, they're just using that diversity to build more diversity, which is just kind of an amazing concept. So I want to close chat box for now. So yeah, we could people spend their whole careers studying insects and herbivores and everything else. Um, and I'm not going to talk about insect herbivory uh, later in the talk. I'll just mention now though that uh, most medicines, a lot of medicines are either plant products or they're derived from plants. I'll throw out a term that you probably haven't heard that we use. Uh, a lot of both good and bad drugs, like cocaine or as well as caffeine and coffee, and some of the chemicals you'll find in chocolate. We call those plant secondary compounds because they're not needed. They're not part of the primary biosynthetic, part of the primary metabolism of those plants. What does a plant need to do to make a living? It needs to capture, it needs to CO2, needs to have photosynthesis, it needs to be able to build stems and leaves, needs to be able to produce a flower, it has some vascular tissue, and they're just basic things that a plant needs to do. And each of those has some chemistry behind it and different types of tissues. But why would a plant produce cocaine or heroin? Okay. It's not, you don't have to do that to be a plant. That's just kind of extra. It's secondary. Well, plant secondary compounds, the incredible chemical diversity we see in plants, which we use, for medicine and other reasons. Most of that is evolved as a response to defend plants from herbivores, and most of those herbivores are insects. So, when next time you have caffeine and coffee, or you realize there's some stuff in your chocolate that makes it fun, all the little chemistry of the chocolate, it's like those are anti-herbivore compounds that evolved over millions of years in all sorts of different plants. So, yeah, insects. Yeah, maybe I'm detouring here, but grasses are really boring, right? We're going to talk about grazers, which can eat grass, cows and bison and elephants or whatever but a lot of the fascinating ecology in a grassland has to do with between these little herbivores and all the flowers growing there. That's a detour. Most of my career, I've studied the grasses, not the flowers. Okay. Grasses allocate most of their productivity, the biomass they have below ground. Okay. So you walk into a grassland, if you walk into a forest, you see a lot of biomass. You see those trunks and those stems and the leaves, and you see all that wood, and it's like there's a lot there. A lot of grasslands, especially if they've been grazed or burned or it's been a drought or something, it's like there's not a lot above ground. And you may think there's not a lot of activity there. But grasses are usually allocating at least half, often closer to 80% of all the photosynthate, all the sugar they produce in photosynthesis, it's just shipping it below ground into a root system. Okay. And those roots are going to live several years. They're going to go deep. They're going to go wide. I was just working on a project with colleagues yesterday, and we're going to be talking about how sod houses, some of the pioneers in the Great Plains homesteaders often had to use pieces of sod, just cut a chunk of the top of the grass and the soil about 6 inches deep and cut it in pieces like a brick and then just build a house with it. And they've held together for 150 years, some of them, because of all that dense root system. So anyway, I detour again, but they're allocating a lot of their nutrients and their biomass and their carbon below ground. Okay, we'll talk about why that's important in a bit. For a number of reasons, partly the climate, the drier climate, but partly also the chemistry of those grass roots and such. They tend to decompose fairly slowly, which means that organic matter is kind of hanging around, building up. If I grew up in Iowa, and after 100 years of agriculture, 100 years of plowing some of this soil that had prairies in it, uh, uh, that soil is still dark and black. The black part of that soil is the soil organic matter. If you put it in an oven and cook it, the soil organic matter volatilizes, you're just left with sand and silt and clay. It'll be kind of a grayish neutral color. So it's like the grasses put that fertility into the soil over thousands of years since the last glacier, put it in the bank, and farmers today in these areas are still taking that money out of the bank, but there's a lot there. They could have lost 40, 50% of the organic matter in those soils after 100 years, but the soils still work. They're still fertile. So prairie soils can be amazing, especially kind of in the wetter end of the prairies. I'll show you it shortly. Well, yeah, a graph on that. And I love history. It's just an interesting tangent. If some of you have read or thought about the settlement of North America, um, the settlers crossed the prairies initially in the mid 1800s. They all wanted to go to California or Oregon. They all wanted to go to the West Coast because there were forests out there, and they assumed, oh, there's forests. Those must be good soils for agriculture. And then when they went across Nebraska, they said, I'm not going to settle here. You can't even grow a tree in Nebraska. They must have lousy soils. Well, Iowa and Nebraska actually had some of the best soils. And it wasn't until later they realized that. Okay, let's keep moving ahead. Climate, fire, and herbivory. That's kind of the answer to this question I raised here. What determines why it's a grassland rather than a savanna, rather than a shrubland, rather than a desert? Part of it's climate, but often it's not the mean annual temperature or the mean annual precipitation. It's the variability of the climate. Have you had a drought, a huge drought recently? Grasses and flowers are just more resilient than trees to drought. They don't take as many years to grow back. Have you had herbivores that have been favoring the grasses and browsers that have been killing the woody shrubs and stuff? And what's the role of fire? Fire pushes you in one way or the other. Okay, so we'll talk a bit more about that. Grasslands can occur across a broad range of climate, from wet to dry. You can have pretty wet areas, tropical grasslands that get a lot of precipitation every year, but they usually have a dry season. Okay, a tropical rainforest generally doesn't have a dry season that's pronounced. The dry season, maybe the dryness for 3 months, 4 months of the year kills the trees, keeps it a grassland. What's more likely in a lot of tropical areas is the dry season creates the conditions under which natural fires could really spread. And the dry season facilitates fire or facilitates other processes. And those are what keep it grassland. We're going to talk, I'm going to show you a graph. I'm not going to explain it. Grasslands, although you can't see it, can store a lot of carbon or sequester a lot of carbon. We know that atmospheric CO2 is increasing from fossil fuel combustion. And we talk about things we can do to reduce the amount of CO2, extra CO2 going in. As you know, CO2 is the key ingredient in photosynthesis. So if you get more photosynthesis, you can tie up that CO2. But where are you going to put it? You're going to put it in wood, above ground, or are you going to stick it in the ground as a grassland where it actually might become soil organic matter? So grasslands can store a huge amount of carbon, but you don't see it. I found this this is in a recent paper. It's trying to look at all the variables. I think I'll just say the carbon cycle is complex. There's a lot of scientists trying to study it, a lot of data being collected, people trying to figure out where this extra CO2 we put in the atmosphere as humans, where is it ending up? And I'll throw out a number, and you can think about that later. If we look at all the CO2 that we release globally through fossil fuel combustion, that means burning natural gas to heat your home. That means gasoline in your car. That means burning coal to make an electrical power plant somewhere. Only about half of the CO2 that we release as humans, modern humans, shows up in the atmosphere. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we used to call this the missing carbon. We realized that politically wasn't very effective because we did understand where it was going. That extra CO2 is ending up either in the oceans or on land. We call these sinks. Something is taking up the little phytoplankton in the ocean, or chemical processes in the ocean, plants on Earth, on the terrestrial side of it. Something's taken up and responding positively to that extra CO2 and able to take it up. Grasslands are part of that story. Okay. And you'll see fire, you'll see deforestation, you'll see croplands, you see grazers and livestock. Yeah, there's a lot of parts of this. We'll leave it here for now. But there's a lot of money, there's a lot of important science to be done, and you're going to be living with the alteration of the carbon cycle by modern society your entire life. Probably worth understanding a little bit. How grasses grow. Take home message, not learning all the names for the parts of a grass, but they keep the key growing point at or below ground level. So this little graphic over here, it could be a drought killing the plant above ground. It could be fire killing it above ground. It could be grazing that eats it above ground, but you haven't killed the growing point, which we call the meristem. Okay. A woody plant, those meristems, those growing points are all above ground at the ends of the branches of the trees where the buds are in the leaves. Okay. So a grassland protects its growing points, and most of its biomass is in this root system. So if it's a healthy grassland, a drought, a fire, or grazing it all down to the nubbins, it's just black or all taken off. Yeah, the grassland, if you do that repeatedly, that'll hurt it. Maybe in a dry climate, start to cause loss of those grasses, desertification, but no, incredibly resilient. And they can spread below ground. One of the things you'll learn in a college biology class is what's the difference between a stolon and a rhizome. It's just underground stems allow these grasses to spread, reconquer that space. Okay. Another thing I'm not going to try to explain today, but if you're going to understand how grasslands really function, eventually you're going to need to understand what the C3 and C4 photosynthetic pathways are. I'm not sure if they teach this in high school biology or not, but it has huge consequences. And not all, but many of our important grasses have this C4 photosynthetic pathway. And it just basically a C4 plant is able to keep its stomates closed a lot more and still get CO2 for photosynthesis. Because when your stomates are open, you're losing water. For a C3 plant, which is what the photosynthesis has been on Earth for 1 billion years, is all this traditional C3 photosynthesis. If you're a leaf, the only way you're going to get CO2 in the plant to make sugar is if you open your stomates and you're going to let water out. Okay. And so C4s figured out a way to kind of beat that. And it meant that C4s were much more efficient in the use of water, and they're actually much more efficient in the use of nitrogen, a key nutrient. Rubisco, it's part of the biochemistry. If you're going to learn one enzyme, this is the name for one enzyme. It's the most abundant enzyme on the face of the earth. It's probably 20 to 30% of all the nitrogen in leaves on the face of the earth is in this one enzyme that is used to capture the CO2, turn it into sugar. Okay. It's not a very efficient enzyme. C4 plants over the last 15 million years have made that more efficient. So without further delay, okay. So most of the world's, I mean, we showed you this graph of the world's grasslands, okay? And this is kind of major natural or native grassland types. Some of these are kind of intact, some of them are not. The tropical ones tend to be a little more intact, although some of these regions in South America are rapidly being converted to production of soybeans and grazing of cattle. There's issues with African savannas, this tropical savannas of Australia. A lot of those are still kind of intact, not heavily exploited. Man, most of the native grasslands of Eurasia, the steppes, obviously Ukraine is in the news a lot these days because of the war with Russia. But Ukraine was one of the world's great grassland countries or regions. Most of those grasslands were converted to agriculture, and those areas are now, just like the Midwest grows a lot of corn, Iowa, northern Illinois, southern Minnesota, parts of Indiana and Ohio. I mean, this is some of the most productive farmland in the world. Ukraine, these areas of grassland that are now cropland, some of the most productive in the world. Okay. So I commented on that. This is what percent of native grasslands are still intact. A recent study, backed by a colleague here at Nebraska. You'll see an area, I'll show you a picture in a second, of the Nebraska sandhills, which is pretty much intact. and 60 to 85% intact. You still got native grasslands. You can still walk on some university properties for a mile, barely see a tree, just see native grasses and cattle, or bison. Okay. But then you see other areas. This is Iowa. This is northern Illinois. This is what we call the Corn Belt. That's all been plowed up. I grew up in Iowa. I didn't see a prairie till I was in high school. It was all gone. And this is where Ukraine is over here. These areas over here. Less than 1% in northern Ukraine, maybe 10% in southern Ukraine. I mean, that it's all plowed up. It's gone. That's the basis of modern, those are the breadbaskets of the world. Even South America, the pampas of South America, that's mainly grassland production now. And they produce grain in parts of this area here, Africa as well. So we can think about grasslands from a conservation point of view. Where are the native grasslands left? What kind of native wildlife do we have? And there's both all that plant and insect diversity we talked about, but a lot of interesting, fascinating mammals. So the sandhills of Nebraska, if you have a chance with your family, or it depends on how you're driving to get to Lincoln, if you're coming here in May, if you have to get from Colorado, I saw somebody was from Littleton, if you're driving from Denver area to Lincoln, Nebraska, if you can take a few hours, convince whoever's driving, go north off the interstate, you get into the sandhills. It's just an incredible grassland landscape. The route along the Platte River, and it's just kind of beat up from a conservation point of view. Here's a picture from East Africa, Mongolia, great grasslands and interesting, still wild horses and asses of different kinds and antelopes of different kinds. So incredible mammal diversity. A point I want to make, though, stress, is that most of the world's grasslands, okay, are used by people. They have been used by people for a long time. You'll hear a little bit more about this. Hopefully, it was the Mongolian government that started this, but the UN is having the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. Rangelands are grasslands that are used by people for livestock. Okay. But then here's a list of all these possible species, right? It's not just cattle, it's bison, it's buffaloes, it's camels, it's alpacas, it's horses, goats, reindeer, yaks. There's just a lot of, quote, livestock species. Okay. And you can see, if you go to Latin America, you see some llamas and goats and cattle and all the different things sent back there in Mongolia, all the different types of livestock or animals these people are raising. It isn't just cows and beef, and it's not just beef, it's milk and all sorts of other products, wool, Angora wool, mohair, a lot of products. So usually when you see the word rangeland, it implies there's people there making a living, and that there's some fascinating cultures. So that's just something to think about. We don't just take the people out of the story. Okay. Now, John, my watch says that we're clipping along. I got like 7 minutes left. Is that it?
Yeah, we're getting close
Okay.
to the end, and I know you want to touch on some of your current work, and we have 2 questions in the chat
Okay.
that I think we want to tackle. So just to kind of keep that in perspective.
Well, why don't we tackle the questions a little bit?
All right. And these both come from Travis. His first question is really kind of a getting to your idea of the CO2 being sequestered.
Yeah.
And he wanted to know, is more CO2 being sequestered in grasslands or forest if they had the same mass of vegetation?
A forest could probably out capture CO2 compared to a grassland, but then that grassland is usually living in a drier environment. It's so much of it's driven by climate. What we find, there have been people that all over the world, that thought they could, for this happened for 150 years. It was kind of a colonial thing, that you could fix a grassland by planting trees in it. Okay. And we still hear that a little bit. Well, areas that, there are areas of South Africa where they planted plantations, often of non-native pine trees in South Africa 100 years ago. Yeah, you maybe store more carbon by growing those pine trees in that dry area of South Africa. But those pine trees, they suck. They use a lot of water. They've dried that soil out. And what they're finding is they're not recharging their aquifer. Their reservoirs have run dry. People in Cape Town don't have water because they've converted their grassland hillsides to trees. So there's huge trade-offs. And they're cutting down the forests now to try to restore the grasslands. So fascinating question, but there's a lot of complex trade-offs. You got to think, well, what works best? All
Yep.
factors considered. What's the other question?
Well, then Travis gets in and it kind of, I think, touches on what you're just talking about, because he asks, if we were to repopulate an area with more vegetation, is it better to try to introduce more grasses or other plants? And based on that kind of story you were just telling, I think you're saying it's probably better off, if it's grassland, you want it to be grasses.
You're better off to model. So there's a big difference between, and these words come up. There is reforestation. You're going to take an area where we cut, like the eastern United States, the Amazon, we cut down forests. We want to grow forests back. That's reforestation. Okay. Another term, though, is afforestation. And that's what I was talking about. You're planting trees, a forest where there was no forest in the past. And we find often that that is a mistake. The fact is, you plant a forest out in the middle of the Great Plains, there's a good chance a fire is just going to burn it up. And if somebody's paying you to sequester that carbon in those trees out in the middle of Nebraska in the sandhills, and then they burn up, well, who's left holding the bag? Some European person, some European factory that's consuming CO2 and wants to buy it. It's far safer to have that in soil organic matter. Trees in some environments are very vulnerable. So, okay. Well, let's shift ahead. So I'm going to talk just with the last couple minutes. Yep. I probably won't get to my fascinating fossils, but that's just another day. You're going to have to corner me if you come to Nebraska at end of May, and we'll go to the museum and then we can learn about the evolution of grazers and grasslands, because no place tells it better in the world than here in Nebraska. Imagine a gradient in West Africa from the Sahara Desert through the Sahel, which used to be more grassland, countries like Mali, Senegal, Niger, into the Sudan. This is a gradient at the top from desert through kind of savanna into woodland, and by the time you get near the coast, that's rainforest. Okay. So this is a graph, old study, looking at grasslands across that gradient from the Sahara down to the tropical forest at the bottom. And what we'll see, the productivity of the grasslands on the right is very high when you got a lot of rainfall. So for grasslands down here, maybe you've cut down the forest, or maybe they're just areas that have been maintained as grassland, high productivity. But part of how grasslands work, part of how, this is my herbivore, this is a fossil bison tooth I was just messing with. When you look at herbivores in a grassland, it's not just the quantity of stuff they have to eat. The quality matters. And just for like you, this is probably my last concept, quality, part of that is readily used energy, which we think of sugar, carbohydrates, but you can't just live on donuts, right? You need some nutrients. One of the key nutrients for any herbivore is protein. And so on average, when the grasses grow tall, they're stemmy and they're low in protein. So this is a huge trade-off between the quantity of the grass, the forage that's produced, and the quality. And so what we'll see is in the Sahel, if you can find grass to eat, it actually is much more nutritious than it is down here near the tropical forest. Protein crashes as it gets wet, whereas biomass increases. And I'll probably finish with this graph. And this is just rainfall. It's huge rainfall grade. This is all the grassland biome here. okay, across Nebraska. Iowa's over here. That was grassland too. I think I distorted the states here. It would make the drive even longer in this distorted graph. Nebraska isn't quite that wide, but we're going from like 30 inches down to like less than 15 inches of precip. And that's this tall grass, mixed grass, short grass, different kind of grasslands. Uh, and the upshot is in these dry grasslands, this is probably a picture of northeast Colorado. That's as much production as you're going to see in that grassland. That's as much biomass as you'll ever see right there. Uh, and you'd say, well, that's got to be bad for an herbivore. There's just not much there. But the protein content, even when they're dried up, of these grasses is far higher. Whereas you get these tall grasses, this sea of grass, 6 feet tall, big blue stem and switchgrass and Indian grass in the tall grass prairie, what would have been in Iowa, that much of the year, that tall grass is just not, doesn't have the nutrition to help sustain a large grazer. So it's this trade-off between quantity and quality. And that's one reason that the huge bison herds that went extinct by the 1870s in North America, most of the bison were out here in the shortgrass prairie. They weren't in the tallgrass prairie in Iowa. And say, but there's more grass in Iowa. Well, it wasn't as nutritious. So this was the same thing he was showing here in Africa. So that's what these gradients are one of the huge things across grasslands and climate. And where that comes in, I'll stop with this quote because it's my favorite from an older South African ecologist. You chew on this one, literally. Fire is an herbivore that does not require protein for growth. We talk about fire being important in the Midwest if we're trying to restore and manage a prairie. They use fire quite a bit in other continents like Africa. Northern Australia has a lot of fire in its tropical grasslands. Well, why is there so much grass there in the dry season? Why is that grass left over? Why didn't an herbivore eat it? Well, it wasn't nutritious enough for an herbivore. There's one herbivore that can use that grass. It's when the fire sweeps through, because fire just needs energy. It doesn't care whether it's lignin or cellulose or sugar. It needs carbohydrates for energy. It doesn't care about the protein. So these are the sort of things we worry about when we manage grasslands. And I think, and we start to understand that it's climate and the fire and the grazing are interacting really complex way in different types of grasslands. And that's how those grasslands function. And somehow you have to find that balance right if you want to conserve that grassland. So
very cool. And it helps explain something that I always wondered about in terms of, you think of cattle ranching and you think back to like kind of Westerns and that,
yeah.
And even to this present day, that most of the big cattle ranches are like West Texas, where it's nearly desert, or even some of the places in Arizona, like cattle ranching was huge. And like you think of Arizona as being largely desert, and they can get away with it because essentially the food's better, even though there's not that much of it.
But the ecosystem is fragile. Those grasses aren't resilient forever. They need a rest. They need a break. And there's shrubs coming on, sagebrush is coming on. And so you got to have a fire now and then to knock back some of the shrubs that are coming in, and the junipers and stuff. So I don't know. And let's see if there's final questions and we can kind of wrap this up. And gall darn it, you literally are going to have, I got a fossilized horse, got my bison tooth. This is a giraffe tooth. And this is a wildebeest tooth. And we'll just leave it for now. Why those are different. This one's a browser. This one's a grazer. And you can read up on that or send me an email, heck, if you want to pursue that. Fascinating.
Yeah, guys, if you get a chance, and I will, we'll work with Dave to see if he might be willing to do something for nationals, or we see if we can set up another one where he can come back and just talk about this research, because what he's doing and how he's using these fossils to understand ancient environments is very cool.
And I think And
Go ahead.
I don't know what to do with wild horses. Horses, here's a horse jaw from the Ice Age, found in a river in Iowa, and I've exposed the teeth here. This was an old horse. It's not old because it's a fossil. It's old because this was an old horse. He was probably over 20 years old, and you can tell because his teeth are about worn out. Uh, Horses evolved over 50 million years in North America. We had like 5 species of horses running around Nebraska 3 million years ago, 5 million years ago. And then horses just went extinct at the end of the Ice Age 10,000 years ago when the mammoths and mastodons went extinct. So that's just a grassland management goal. So horses have been here for 50 million years. But when we brought back Spanish horses 500 years ago and they started running around, wow, are they natural? Do they belong here? Or are they just a feral, non-native species? Horses can beat up a landscape. So yeah, I don't know. And then we don't eat horses, right? Other countries do. It's just not a popular American thing to do. I'm just I don't know what to do with horses and grasslands. I struggle with that.
Well, I think that's an excellent segue into the final question here.
Yep.
And it has to deal with what happens to animals as they say when the classification of a region changes, but essentially the ecology of it evolves or the ecosystem evolves. And the animals, how do they respond to it, right? Is it they can't quite adapt, so the shift from grassland to desert, or because the timing, does it allow the animals to adapt, or do the majority of them die off? And it kind of sounds like some of the stuff you're sharing is that extinction's a real possibility.
I think if you're on that gradient between grassland, woodlands, savanna, woodland, I mean, most of the species can persist if you're kind of moving back and forth different portions of the landscape. It could be a fire, it could be a drought, but all the players are still in the game, right? But if you go from grassland to extensive desert, there's just a bunch of species that you'll lose some plant species and then you lose some insect species and you're going to lose other species. But same thing, if you go from grassland to dense closed canopy forest, once there's no open grassland left for 20 miles in any direction, it's all just forest. And a lot of the eastern US will go that way naturally without fire. And species. So resilient, but we use that word threshold. At some point, you cross a threshold, and then you lose that one as a player. A lot of conservation, a lot of conservation, and this to ecology students. And these was trying to understand how these, like a piece of forest, worked as a natural landscape. What was the role of fire and floods and hurricanes? I mean, how did that forest perpetuate itself? And the thought is, for management, if we really want to conserve it, we should try to make it function like it used to before settlement and all that. So we're trying to restore it to a previous state. That's not the way ecologists think in the year 2025. It's like things have changed too much. They're changing too quickly. We realize we can't take a grassland in Nebraska or Iowa or a forest in Massachusetts and make it work the way it worked 200 years ago. The climate, everything's changed too much. The species, invasive species, and everything else. So the word people like to use, we're still trying to define what it means today, is, well, we want a resilient forest. And resilient means it can take some of the insults and dynamics and some hurricanes and storms and fires. And, in California, will those mountains that surround the city of Los Angeles, will they be resilient after these huge fires over the last 2 weeks? That's the question. It's not, are they going to go back to the way they were? They're not. But are they going to maintain the species that they had? Will the wildlife still be able to adjust, because it is changing and it will continue to change? So,
No, it's very helpful, and hopefully that answered the question. Everybody, if you could, can we say thanks today for doing this fantastic presentation again.
But
Love it because I love learning new stuff, and like talking with you always comes up cool things. And like I said, we will talk to see if we can set up another opportunity to delve into some of this work for those of you guys that are interested as the season kind of progresses here. But otherwise, thank you for attending. I'll put out a plug. We have one more webinar this week. So if you happen to be doing Codebusters or any of your teammates are doing Codebusters, we have a webinar tomorrow night with our chief Codebuster himself, in John Tobis from North Carolina, and he'll tackle your Codebusters questions. See, Margot's asked, or actually, there's a question here. Can we do some other biomes? We'll look to see what we can do.
yeah, Margot said, was that hard to make this presentation?
Yeah.
No, this is what I live and think about this. It's hard to talk about it. I don't have 8 hours with you guys. I would have gotten through my material. I only had an hour. That's what makes it.
So, all right. Well, we will look to get this doing stuff. Like I said, everyone that attended will get the link to you for the recording as soon as it's available.
Okay.
And it will go up on Science Olympiad TV. So thank you guys. Have a great rest of the week, and good luck on the rest of your season.
Okay. So I had all those places, Michigan, Ohio, Littleton, etc., where you're at. Okay.
All right. Have a great night.
Yep.